ditto. The same thing happens. The Persians are not making significant headway. And then it's on the night of day 2 of the actual battle that the turning point comes. And
it's like a legion. It's 1,000 people. So an alaf became the right? And then you have the house Beit, which became the B. And you had a Gemel, which was a camel. So that became the Ge. So in each case, or Dalith, which was the door, right, became the D. So all of these things were just ideographs for those symbols, and then they just lost that piece at the end. But what made the Phoenicians so interesting is that instead of breaking it down by syllable, they actually were able to break out sound components, which is not an intuitive thing to do because we can't make sound components with our mouth. We can only make consonant vowel clusters. You need a vowel in there somewhere in order to pronounce it.
Well,
some unknown genius had that insight about 900 BC. It's really, it always impressed me that ancients could, figure out the difference between a consonant and a vowel and write it. It's really quite impressive when you think about it, because it's true. Most consonants are kind of invisible. Most stop consonants, they're just like P is just, you put your lips together, but as Richard said, you need a vowel to actually pronounce it. So
yeah, exactly.
Lisa is here. I'm gonna give her a control. Hi, Lisa. How are you?
I'll be right back.
Hey, did I hear something about getting some control?
Yes.
All right, I like it.
Hold on. The thing is, they told me that I can give you control without bothering you with people in the waiting room. So maybe I'll give it another.
All you got to do is let her share her screen. She doesn't.
No, hold on. I know, Paul. But 1 second. I just called Zoom 2 seconds ago, and for her to share the screen, she has to be co-host. That's what they told me. It doesn't work that way. Yeah.
I think they recently, at the end of September, made some changes.
I mean, if I click share screen right now, nothing's going to happen.
That's right.
Yeah.
Nothing's going to happen.
Yeah.
So that's why I apologize, guys. All right. But you know what? Jerry's here. Let's wait 5-10 minutes, and then I'll give you control just to make sure. The thing is, I didn't want to put a password because last time people, it was, people didn't even log in because they didn't password. Just wanted to make sure that everybody logs in. The room is much better because this way, how's everybody doing? Look, oh my God, we already have 19 people. It's just starting at 12. Yeah. Some kind of record here. Lisa, today, I think you're pulling the records today. All kind of numbers are broken. Hey, where are you?
Doing.
Oh my God,
yeah.
That was an interesting.
Wait, Greg, are you on the floor? Oh, okay.
No, almost. No, that's I'm on a Cape Cod. This is the wall. It looks like a floor, yeah. And I'm in like a wooden house on a there's a beach, water right here.
Ah, nice.
Nice.
What water are you near?
It's a bay in the Cape Cod. I'm in the Provincetown.
Okay.
Erica, you turned on your camera today. What's the occasion?
Camera. Let's turn the camera. I just
No, yeah, he just looks. He just looks more relaxed.
Yeah, it's a man's retreat. They're like a bunch of friends. Only men here. All the wives are left behind. Yeah, that's
that's why you look so relaxed.
I know. It's something.
Portable man cave.
Hi.
Unbelievable.
I finally get to see what you look like. I love your hair.
Oh well, what hair?
Yeah. After a while, we just get a haircut, open up our ears. That's all.
I'm already drinking beer. Yeah.
I want to welcome.
It's 5 o'clock somewhere. Yeah, it's noontime for you, Greg.
Yeah.
I want to welcome some new people. Louisa, hi.
Hi.
Who else?
Heard about you from Richard.
New person. Yes, Rich is the
Richard
man.
and I just did a presentation for the other history group.
Oh yeah. Oh, thank you guys. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Zach, is it Lisa and Richard who are doing the presentation again this year or this Saturday?
It's going to be Lisa, and I'm going to have a few words towards the end.
It's Lisa squared.
No, as I was telling Zach before Lisa joined, she did the bulk of the work on this one. She put together over 60 slides. It was an incredible undertaking.
Richard, I think you were supposed to be the one doing the mediation in a presidential, campaign. I love the way you introduce people. And right now is Mr. Biden and Donald Trump, and you probably did a better job than what happened. That was a terrible.
Well, no, I think that debate went about as well as it could have because you have one person who's on the edge of dementia and the other one who's gone completely crazy, and you can't even and with that description, you don't even know which two I'm talking about. Which is the real scary part. This nation of 320 million people. This is the best we could produce.
Oh boy.
Maybe we should go to a monarchy again.
We never had one.
So anyway, Lisa, I wanted to make a request to Lisa, since she's done at least 75% of the work here today. If you don't mind, in the beginning, maybe if it's just a minute, to give a bit of an overview of the previous, just like the total big picture. Hey, this is what's going on in this century, sort of thing, and this is why this is going on. Just kind of
maybe it's good before.
Good idea.
I remember some marathon from the last time, but I'm already forgetting some of it, and I certainly forget some of the. I certainly forgot.
Sure. How about I take that?
You're not going to talk about the soldiers and the arms and the weapons.
Let's focus right now. Richard, go ahead. You just give a summary right now, and then I'll give control to Lisa, and we'll get started.
So in the previous time, we talked about several different things that were occurring around the Aegean. So under Cyrus the Great, the Persian armies took the western part of Anatolia, which included several Greek city-states called the Ionian city-states, right? So these are city-states in Anatolia. They're not in mainland Greece or in the islands. And they were conquered by the Persian army because the Persian army is a land army. The Ionian states were feeling economic and political constriction from the Persian Empire, in a way that other parts of the Persian Empire were also facing, but they felt it more severely because of the cultural difference, right? As Greek city-states, they were more prone to this idea of independence and control in their monetary affairs. So they revolted in what was called the Ionian Revolt. And it wasn't just these Greek city-states that revolted. They tried to secure assistance from the city-states on the Greek mainland. And they did get assistance from two Greek city-states, Athens and Eritrea. When the Persians put down the Ionian Revolt in the successive wars, they saw the initial Athenian attack of the Persian regional capital of Sardis, where they burned the entire city to the ground, as being this horrible act of violence that was completely indefensible by the lights of civilized behavior. And so King Darius of the Persian Empire declared war on the Greeks, and he was committed to bringing the Greeks down for having destroyed the city of Sardis. So he commenced a first invasion over the north, led by General Mardonius, who was his relative by three different ways, because the sisters always marry on all the sides. But Mardonius led a campaign, and on land he was generally successful, but his naval force was destroyed by a strong wind off the coast of Mount Athos, and so the first invasion style was frustrated. The second invasion was led by a different general, Datis and Artaphernes, these two generals together, and they decided to do an island hopping campaign. So they first invaded the island of Naxos. After taking that, they made landfall on the island of Euboea, which is where the city-state of Eritrea is, and the Eritreans were defeated. And then the population of Eritrea was moved into captivity into Iran. And the Persians then made landfall at Marathon, where the Athenians were encamped to defeat them. And the Greeks were able to do it. We can go over the battle tactics again if you want, but the Greeks were ultimately victorious at Marathon and thus frustrated the attempts of Darius's army to take them over. and Darius soon dies after this. He dies peacefully, but because of the time of his death, the war is now inherited by his son, Xerxes. And Xerxes vows to do what Darius could not do, and to destroy the Greek states in retribution for the attacks at Ionia and the previous failures in the previous 2 attack waves.
Thank you.
Can we ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah, Eritrea you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the same? Is similar geographically to the modern state of Eritrea? It seems a long way away.
No. Eritrea is a Greek city-state on the island of Euboea. So if you are in Athens and you were to fly an airplane like straight due north, it would take you about 10 minutes to get to Eritrea. That's sort of where it is. Yeah.
It's basically right across the bay from Marathon.
Exactly that. Marathon is on the eastern side of Attica. If you go around to the northern side of Attica, and it's right across the water. It's a very small channel between the island of Euboea and the mainland of Attica, and that's exactly where Eritrea is. It's on the southern side of the island of Euboea.
Just an accidental sound resemblance with the modern Eritrea and northern Ethiopia. I assume it's accidental. So
yeah, it is accidental.
It's a country in northern, well, no longer northern Ethiopia, but that region.
Yeah, that was the first time I'd heard of the Greek version, and I had to think, well, no, it can't be the Ethiopian, the African Eritrea.
There's also a spelling difference. The African one is E-R-I-T-R-E-A, and the Greek one is E-R-E-T-R-E-A.
Usually pronounced Eritrea.
Okay.
All right.
The Greek one, Paul, or
the Greek one?
The Greek one, Eritrea. Okay. Good to know. I'll try and remember that. But we will actually have a map that's presented, several maps, so we'll be able to see it in context of the Greek mainland as well.
So go ahead, Lisa. It's your show.
We're ready. Okay, we're ready to roll. Okay, so the disclaimer is that I'm not a historian, but I'm just super passionate about this stuff. And what we're going to be talking about today, we're on part 2 of our battle plan. We covered the background information in the Battle of Marathon last time. This time, we're going to be talking about the interlude, what happened between the Battle of Marathon and then the subsequent battles between the Persians and the Greeks. And that's really what we're going to be talking about for the next 2 hours here. So,
we're going to talk about the interlude, then we're going to talk about the next set of Persian campaigns and how the Greeks responded to them.
Correct. And so those items that are highlighted on this timeline, it's the same timeline we looked at last time, are the ones we're going to be specifically talking about here. In August, we have the battles of Thermopylae and the Battle of Artemisium, which was happening simultaneously. We have the Battle of Salamis in September of 480, and then we have the Battle of Plataea in 479. Here's a map, a reminder of where we're at kind of on the Greek and Asian land masses here. The sites that we're going to be speaking to specifically are Artemisium. Again, you see here's the city-states that Richard was just speaking about, Eritrea. And then we have Artemisium up here on the northern coast of that island. Thermopylae, that's across that bay there on the land. We're going to be speaking about Salamis, which is down here. That will be a naval battle. And we'll also be speaking about a land battle, Plataea, in 479. So during the interim, the interlude between the Battle of Marathon and then the next attack and counterattack, what happened? What was going on? From the Greek side of things, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. If folks could go on mute, that would be awesome.
Please mute your lines, guys.
Yeah, we got a full-on conversation happening in the background. Let me actually see if I can find the guilty party there.
You, as a host, you can mute them.
Okay. Okay. In any case, so what's happening between 490 and 480 BCE? We have this guy, Themistocles, who is the one of the naval commanders of the what will be the Hellenic League's fleet. And he has basically been telling the Greeks that, hey, the Persians are not done with us. We may have had a victory at the Battle of Marathon, but they're going to be back. They'll be back, is what I'm thinking here.
Yeah.
And
Additionally, Themistocles makes the argument, which is a correct argument, which is that the Persian force assembled under Darius was an expeditionary force. Datis and Artafernes were given a very small portion of the empire soldiers to command. And if the Persian Empire comes back with the full might of their armies, then Athens will be completely unprepared if they don't make sweeping changes.
And that's the platform that Themistocles is arguing against. He really is wanting folks to buy into the fact that they are going to be under attack again, and it's going to be even worse than the initial assaults here. So what does he advocate for? He advocates for the investment in a strong navy and the formation of a unified front against the Persians, which will be called the Hellenic League. He very fortunately, Athens will come into a significant amount of money because there is a main silver vein that's tapped into at close by mines in Laurium. And with that money, he's able to convince the Athenian assembly, instead of having each of the citizens pocket some of the money, the proceeds from that mine strike, to actually invest it in an Athenian navy. So he's very adept at convincing people and winning people over to his side of things. The power of persuasion.
One thing is that he doesn't do it by telling them about Persia. He basically, there's a little island called Aegina near to Athens, and Athens had been at war with them, and that's the enemy that he uses to convince the Athenians to go for the ships. The Persians are seen as too hypothetical.
And that same enemy of Athens has greatly, I guess, tapped into their economy and is pulling money away from Athens, is what I understand why it's such a significant enemy of theirs. So what does Themistocles do? He really looks to the Greeks to unify and fight as one and put aside their individual city-states needs. And he skillfully uses ostracism, which I believe Greg or Paul or someone else, I'm sorry, I can't remember who, spoke to, where the the Athenian assembly would vote on one person, I believe, every year that would be ostracized or exiled for up to 10 years. And he used this technique through the Athenian assembly to get rid of those who were against his philosophy and his strategy. Let me see, what else does he do? So he will be the commander of the Greek fleet. He will largely be calling most of the shots. However, the Spartan commander Eurybiades will be called the admiral, and he's not any kind of just a sitting puppet. He does have strengths of his own, but it really is Themistocles that is commanding the strategy for the Navy. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Hellenic League. This is a coming together of various Greek city-states. They first meet in 481 BCE at Corinth. Corinth is determined to be a somewhat neutral state or neutral meeting location because it's not under necessarily hard Spartan or Athenian control. And Sparta and Athens are the two key dominant players of the Hellenic League. They have the most power of the city-states. Their goal is to resist the Persian onslaught. And Themistocles, again, his skills really do shine because he is able to convince people to stop being so isolationist and self-interested as city-states, but actually to come together. And so this is a novel idea for the Greeks. It's very awkward, as you can imagine, anytime that, different, I guess, philosophies and how you rule and how you are culturally you have some conflict that's happening here. So Sparta is used to hierarchy and obeying orders and giving orders and having those be obeyed. The Athenians have a more, round table diplomacy approach. So you have a little bit of a conflict just in terms of how they operate. And what's accomplished out of this first meeting is that they do come to agreements that there will be a common front to meet the Persians. They agree that those city-states that have gone over to the Persians, remember we call that Medizing, that they'll be taxed. They also send envoys to key players that could really help strengthen the Hellenic League, Argos, Crete, Corcyra, to enlist their help. Some of these have outright refused. I think that Crete says they don't want to participate because the oracles have foretold that it was going to be a disaster, so they do not participate. Corcyra does decide to participate. However, their participation is a no-show. They say that they will send 60 ships, but they never materialize. And then the last thing that they agree upon at this first meeting is that they're going to send spies into the Persian camps. And actually, this plays to Xerxes' favor, because what the spies report back, they're actually invited into the camps, is that there are vast numbers, that they are well armed, that there's organization, that they have cavalry and archers. And so it brings back more fear to the Greeks than it does like good knowledge necessarily. So it works. It does have an advantage to the Greeks, but really it's great propaganda for the Persians. We spoke of this again. I'll just briefly touch on it, but why would the Greeks, those city-states that don't participate in the Hellenic League, why would they even consider supporting the Persians? Well, it's in their personal best interest. If the Greeks are unsuccessful in victory over the Persians, then they'll probably suffer fewer consequences as a result. They really do believe that there's no way that the Greeks are going to be able to resist. And I do love this saying that I think most of us are familiar with, the ancient proverb. It's actually from a Sanskrit treaty on statecraft. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Again, remember back, and I think Richard touched on it, that the Greeks city-states there were upwards of 1,000 of them, and they all have kind of their own ideal of how to manage people in government, as well as cultural differences. So the Persians are their enemy, but they're also their friends, because they are enemies of their true enemies. The decree of Themistocles, as I was reading, is somewhat of a controversy. And the reason I'll call it a controversy is because it directly conflicts with information that Herodotus has provided in the histories. And what the decree is, and this is what has been found as an actual stone tablet in which the decree is recorded. It's also called the Trojan decree. And before the Athenian assembly, Themistocles is to have gone before them and said, look, we really do need to abandon Attica, specifically Athens, because we're no way going to be able to resist the Persian onslaught here. He suggests that the women and children get evacuated to Trojan, and the possessions and old men evacuate to Salamis. Those that will stay behind in Athens will specifically be on the Acropolis, and that will include the priests and priestesses of the temples there on the Acropolis, and their goal is really to defend the property of the gods. All other able-bodied men will become part of the navy, and they will staff the triremes. And then he also has basically the positions taken up, decides to meet the Persians at Artemisium on Euboea, and then also to provide a contingent of naval enforcement off the Salamis coast to guard the elder men and the possessions that have been evacuated there. So why this is a bit of a controversy is because in Herodotus's writings, he talks about this being a last ditch, all is lost, let's abandon Athens now. Whereas this shows some strategy, some foresight from Themistocles, and it also kind of shows that there is a real lack of trust from the Athenians that the others in the Hellenic League are actually going to come and help defend Athens. So you already start to see some cracks in the Hellenic League's agreement to be a unified front, if this is in fact a true document.
Can you take questions or comments? Or?
Yes, please.
Yeah, just yeah. So at first, didn't they didn't actually agree to meet the Persians at Artemisium? Weren't they going to meet them at further north? And they actually moved the troops there. And then there was a strange thing that Alexander of Macedon, who was actually an ally of the Persians, warns them it's not a good place. And then they come back and they decide instead to go to Thermopylae.
Lisa, before you answer, I'm sorry, can you let Richard in quickly? Sorry.
Can I let Richard in? I don't see anybody is needing to get in. Everybody's been let in.
I'm in the waiting room because I'm trying to switch to my computer.
Okay. Let me see here. Okay, hold on, please. Hold on. Admit all. Okay, is everybody there?
Yes, we're in.
Yes. Okay. Alrighty.
Okay. Could I also add a little bit to what the previous speakers said? I think that place called the Valley of Tempe, and actually it was the Spartans who marched there, about 10,000 strong, and as it was said before, Alexander I warned them that there is a way around it, and they won't be able to hold their position. So they marched back, and then eventually they've decided to use Thermopylae. But that was the Spartans' kind of role in this, and of course I'm sure you'll give more details. But that's a little details that they, in addition to the naval battle at Artemisium, they were planning to do that.
And we did touch on this last time because I think I confused the dates there on that, but it was Tempe Gorge, and Themistocles was one of the leaders that actually marched up to Tempe Gorge to hold that as a first line. And King Alexander of Macedon had not only the reason to kind of like, he was playing both sides, and it is what I was reading, that one of the reasons he did advise that the Greeks basically fall back more southernly is because that area is still Macedon. And so what was King of Macedon having to do? He was having to host the Persians the longer the Persians stayed. And they were depleting his resources. And so he had it in his best interest to see the Persians march on further south so that he no longer had to host them. So
mythical aside, just this place Troezen is the birthplace of the hero Theseus, who is the national hero of Athens. So they're returning back to their national hero's birthplace.
Okay, interesting. And we'll talk about the Spartan hero later on in this presentation, so that's great. Thank you for that, guys. All right, did that answer your question? I wasn't sure. Was that Mark? Or sorry, I wasn't sure who was asking the question.
It was sort of
the Tempe Gorge.
Just to fill in, and you did, I think, the comments. Thank you very much. Yeah.
There was also a comment in the chat of why did Thebes support the Persians? Thebes supported the Persians, first of all, because they're higher in Boeotia, which meant that they would be more exposed to the Persian army, and therefore more likely to be forced to submit. Also, Thebes, there were a lot more Medizers in Thebes. It was most of the Greek city-states, especially in the northern part of the area, like Thessaly, as well, and certain Greek city-states in Macedonia region were much more likely to submit to the Persians simply because the likelihood of conquest was much higher, and the Persians did guarantee a strong and robust economic and political system. So it's not like, I'm trying to find the right, from the perception of some Greeks, this was like, invasion of communist China. But I think from the majority of Greeks, especially those who were more inclined to be business savvy as opposed to political, this was more invasion of the Americans, in the sense of like, they'll bring wealth and prosperity and all these kinds of things. Okay, you won't have as much political power, but you'll have a more developed country. So there were good arguments for Medizing. It wasn't just like they were traitors.
Right.
One last comment on that, and I think somebody calculated we're about 1,000 city-states in Greece, and only 14 of them or so are fighting on the so-called Greek side, and most of the others were actually.
Jerry, it's 32.
Pardon?
32, not 14.
They're actually fighting?
Yeah, but even still, it's a rounding error.
Small number.
And
a very small percentage, yeah.
I think the major reason that they Medized was because of fear. They had the example of Eritrea, which it was gone. It was off the map. And so this was an existential thing of this gigantic steamroller rolling down through the north. And all of the city-states that were in the path were the ones who Medized.
Yeah.
All right, Lisa.
Yes.
Have a head. Go ahead.
Okay. All righty. Richard, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that sort of we talked about a little bit when we talked about the Persian court under Darius is that Darius was a person who grew up in the Cyrus understanding of what it meant to be a Persian, which is that you came from the region of Fars. Fars is a very desolate region. And so under Cyrus's sort of perception, the hard region of Fars is what gives Persians their ability to conquer, to control.
Richard, I think you froze.
Yeah, I can't hear.
Yeah, we got a bit of a freeze there going on, Richard.
All right, let me text him 1 second. Sorry,
Okay.
guys. And he's probably keeps talking, poor guy. Hold on. Ay.
Based in Fars that controls a large amount of territory.
Richard, Richard, we lost a lot of your conversation. You froze for about a good 1 minute.
Yeah.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll tell me if it's redundant, but so when Cyrus the Great built this empire, right, he built this empire based in Fars, and he had this idea that strong men came from this hostile environment, that the hostile environment forced people to be strong. But at the same time, there was a huge tension in the empire because the region of Fars is isolated physically. There are mountains to the south. It's a plateau region. And so actually administering a large-scale empire from there was very difficult. So Darius made the move to set up a secondary capital, an administrative capital at Susa, which is in the lowland Mesopotamian valley. And that was accessible to all the different satraps within the empire, but it meant that the court life in Susa was very different from the way it had been in Fars originally. And while Darius had set up this administrative capital, he was still a person who had grown up in Fars. He was very much a military man, and you can see from his burial, for example, on his burial tombstone, he wrote, I am good with the spear on foot and on horseback. I'm good with the bow on foot and on horseback. Of all the things that he could say about himself, the fact that he was a military commander and he actually fought with his soldiers was very important to him to establish his rugged Persian identity. But Xerxes, by contrast, his son, grew up in Susa, in this administrative capital. So he was much more acculturated in sort of this modern palace culture that developed in Susa, as opposed to the sort of more rugged Persian culture that existed originally. And the way that he managed to get power anyway was not through primogeniture. He didn't inherit the throne directly. His mother, Atossa, who is also Cyrus the Great's daughter. So Cyrus the Great's daughter married her brother, Darius, and Xerxes is the child. This is actually very common in Achaemenid Persia, that the families intermarry so closely. So Xerxes is the child of incest, and he's not even the first child of Atossa. So he doesn't inherit the rulership because he was next in line. He inherits it because of diplomatic intrigue in the Persian court. So there's a strong sensibility that a lot of the Persians have at this point, that Xerxes is in power not because he's qualified to be in power and that he's this historic, powerful Persian leader that's inherited it through his strength of character, but because he has a number of people in the court fighting for him. And one of the things is that he's very influenced, therefore, by the people in the court that put him in power, such as his mother, the sister queen. So he's also influenced by Mardonius. Mardonius, as we've established, is also related to Darius. Darius's sister married Mardonius's father, and that's where Mardonius comes from. Mardonius's sister also married Darius. So Mardonius, while not being of direct right to rule, is clearly within the royal family and is able to secure Xerxes' rule by help secure Xerxes' rule. But in exchange, he wants more power, and he wants to create a satrap a satrapy, a Persian province where he is the satrap, the governor, and that province would be Greece. So you can see in the images, you can see on the left-hand side, this is what Xerxes was. We have generally identified this relief as Xerxes, but it's not labeled. On the right-hand side is a sculpture of the sister queen Atossa. We can go to the next slide. Can you advance?
I have advanced.
Oh.
Do you not see it yet?
Okay. Yeah, because it's not showing up on my computer, which is weird. But the next slide is the one of the cities, right?
Correct. The
Yeah,
great
okay.
capital.
So I wanted to have this slide so you could see what Susa looked like. So Susa, if you can see on the left-hand side, is an actually very developed city. It has Persian architecture, major walls. This was a functional administrative capital, and it wasn't just that. It had the palace with all of its pomp and circumstance. And so Xerxes was very much a man of the court. He was very much a person who was trapped in this style of living. And you can also see the functional difference of the government at Susa from the government and, the topographical difference between the government in Susa and the government. Pasargadae originally, you can see, right, Pasargadae is significantly uplifted in the Persian highlands in the lower right-hand side of the map, and Susa is in the lowland region, indicated by green in the left-hand side of the map. So,
John, here I have a question. Susa had been the Elamite capital.
It had been, yes.
When did Persia conquer it, I assume?
Persia conquered it under the reign of Cyrus the Great when he took over all of the Babylonian territories.
And did they move into the Elamite palaces, or did they just build their own?
They built their own. I believe Cyrus raised the city, but don't quote me on that.
Okay.
Would these the highlands and the lowlands of Susa, would the people have spoken the same language?
Well, the thing is, the Persian Empire was generally administered in Aramaic, which was the inherited language that they had gotten from the Babylonians in the region. So in terms of ruling Susa outside of the court structure, they would have been speaking Aramaic for the most part. So there wasn't an issue in understanding.
Right.
Excuse me, could you just repeat the name of the city slowly? Before moving to Susa, what was the city?
Pasargadae.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up. That's why.
Yeah, Pasar Gade.
Oh, okay, I see it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so if we go to the next slide, one of the fundamental distinctions between Darius and Xerxes is, as we point out, that Xerxes was this man of pomp and circumstance, much more of the court than of military. And so his general technique in order to destroy the Greeks was shock and awe. His thought process was that he would intimidate the Greeks into surrender more than actually fighting them into surrender. And so he wanted to do several different things. The first one is that he wanted to build the largest army ever assembled, and he actually did that. He went to the satraps of the various satrapies across the empire and demanded a certain levy of soldiers to come meet at Susa, and then they would march from Susa to Sardis, which is on the western part of Anatolia, and then from Sardis they would march to Greece as a unified front. Now this military was, as I said, the largest ever assembled, and would be sort of a demonstration of the might of the Persian Empire. It would also be a demonstration of the diversity of the Persian Empire, because one of the huge values that the Persians held, and we talked about this last time with the relief of the 20 nations that was carved in Nakhshi Rostam, the burial place of the kings, that the Persians saw themselves as the kings of kings, that they ruled over all the nations of the world, all the civilized nations of the world, rather. And so their army was representative of all of the nations contributing. And they wanted to show this sense of, we are everyone. There's no reason to resist because you are already us. And there were Greek nations represented in the army of Xerxes. We have Ionians who are represented. We have Pontic Greeks who are represented. We have certain groups from Cyprus that are represented. So it's not that Greek-speaking people were excluded. In fact, Greek-speaking people were actively included in this large army. Another important point that we brought up last time is that the Persians considered themselves the inheritors of this Ahura Mazda view of bringing brightness into the world. And so they believed that they had the ability to literally shape the world at their will. And so that was another part of the shock and awe tactics that they employed, was that they were literally going to make the world work for them. If you remember from Mardonius' first invasion, when Mardonius had the army was all over the land, responding to the question in the chat. The armies were gathered in Susa, they marched overland to Sardis, and then from Sardis they would march overland. But what the Persians like to do is while they would have an army that would march over land, they would also have a naval fleet that would accompany the coast. And that was what happened in Mardonius' first invasion. You had that Mardonius march over the land, and you had a naval fleet going along the coast. They got to the edge of Mount Athos. We'll see a map in a bit. And when they got to the edge of Mount Athos, there was a strong wind that blew off the mountain, and periodically would blow off the mountain. And this completely destroyed the entire Persian fleet. It was incredibly devastating at that point. And Mardonius had to turn around and come back to Persia because he couldn't continue without this naval accompaniment. So Xerxes was certain that he did not want this same thing to happen again, and he was determined to build a canal to circumvent Mount Athos. We'll see that. But the idea that you could literally cut the dry land and make it into water, was an incredibly awesome thing, inspiring of awe, an incredibly awesome thing to do, because it showed power over the earth. And on the flip side, Xerxes decided that he didn't want to ferry his soldiers across the Hellespont. He wanted to build a bridge to cross it. So he actually built the bridge. He actually commissioned the hulls of triremes and smaller boats, lashed them together with papyrus cords, and made a bridge across the Hellespont. You can actually see the image of the bridge on the right-hand side. So the Persians crossed over the Hellespont while remaining dry. If we can advance to the next slide, we can see a little bit more about the Hellespont Bridge. So you can see where the Hellespont is. I don't know if the Persians had built the Suez Canal, but it wouldn't surprise me if they had tried. It's a lot harder to build the Suez Canal in terms of the length and the depth of the terrain than it is the Mount Athos Canal that we're going to talk about in a bit. But okay, so you can see, you can see on the left-hand side sort of the indication of where the Hellespont is. So it's actually a very thin area that separates the European part of Thrace from Anatolia. And so typically today it takes a ferry about 25 minutes to cross the Hellespont. It would have taken about a day with triremes, and that's typically how people crossed it. People ferried supplies over triremes, and that's what Darius had done originally. But Xerxes wanted to show that he could actually control the territory. Now, the image on the right-hand side seems almost comical, but this is exactly what happened. So Xerxes built the bridge, and then a very powerful storm came and destroyed it. And Xerxes would not let the storm and the waters not be subservient to him. He was the king of kings. So he ordered his soldiers to lash the sea, to give it 300 lashes in response to its horrible misbehavior. And then he had the men send fetters into the water in order to chain the sea and make it succumb to his will. And you can see there in the right-hand side picture, the Persian army actually throwing metal fetters into the water in order to control the water. And he then commissioned a whole new bridge to be built, and not just one, two, one for the army and one for the supplies to follow. And between the construction of this massive Hellespont Bridge and the digging of the Mount Athos Canal, the Persians were showing just how powerful they were and how much they could bend the world to their will. Of course, from the Greek side, this looks like hubris. But from the Persian side, this is a demonstration of power and civilization. If we go to the next slide, we can see a little bit more about Xerxes Canal. So if you look at the map on the left-hand side, you can, yes, Çanakkale is what is the Asian side of the Hellespont today, America. Okay, so if you look at the left-hand side picture, you can see the Chalkidiki, which is a part of Macedonia that juts out into the water. Macedonia is in the northern part of Greece, and the Chalkidiki has 3 promontories. The easternmost promontory is Mount Athos, and it is off the coast of Mount Athos towards the part where the east side meets the south side, where the very strong winds occur. Those winds have dampened down as time has gone on, and the mountain has eroded significantly since the ancient period. But in the ancient period, that was where Mardonius' ships met their end. So at the point that I've circled is actually the thinnest part of the peninsula, and it's also the lowest in terms of altitude point in the peninsula. It's about a few miles, I think it's 1.5 miles wide. And you can see in the right-hand side picture where and you can obviously zoom it in on your screens a little bit if you want to. You can see where the canal was cut. Now, the canal doesn't exist today. It was found through geological surveys because the land has covered it back up, and the breakers that would prevent the seawater from bringing sand in and filling it in have gone away. What?
Rich, a quick question, if you don't mind. I'm flummoxed by what's the point in digging a canal through this one of 3 fingers? Why not? What's special about what? Because if you dig a canal, that's a huge endeavor, and you're only going through one of the 3 fingers. What's kind of? I'm missing the point in a way.
Sure. Well, the first thing is that the ships that both the Persians and the Greeks used were not deep water ships, in the sense that they couldn't carry enough supplies to last for more than 1 day without pulling up on shore at night and resupplying and restocking. They don't have the kind of carrying capacity. It's not that they weren't seaworthy, so they had to hug the coast. And the Persians knew that around this particular point, around Mount Athos, the winds were particularly strong. Around the other 2 promontories, the winds were nowhere near as strong, and those could be dealt with. So the issue was getting around this particular promontory.
Part of the thing may be also just the high altitude of Mount Athos. You have a downdraft from the top of the mountain, so there'll be periodic, very strong forces that blow you offshore.
That's exactly correct.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, that solved it for me. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. And so because of the might and the power of the Persian Empire, the primary constructors of this canal were the Phoenicians, because the Phoenicians had a long shipping history in contrast to the Persians, who were a land-based empire. But one of the problems of having a multinational empire is that you had a Tower of Babel problem, where in order to construct this canal, you had to have people from all these different nations working together under one model. And that is exactly what doesn't work, because you had people from Egypt, and you had people from in the Indus River Valley, and you had people from Armenia, and a lot of these people had never built canals in their lives. And they certainly weren't as skilled as the Phoenicians were. But the problem was that the Phoenicians couldn't explain to them in a coherent way how to build this canal. So while the Phoenician part, which was the central part of the canal and the deepest to dig, was built properly, in that they built wider at the edges and then down in sort of a trapezoidal shape, right? So that way the sand doesn't fill back in. The way most of the other parts of the canals were built were straight down, which, if you've ever tried to build a sandcastle, you know doesn't work, because the sides just pour right out. So not only did they dig the canal once, they actually had to dig it out twice to fix all of the problems from the sides caving in. The canal had to be between 80 and 100 feet wide in order to accommodate the width of the triremes that were passing through. So this was a huge undertaking, and it took a year and change for them to actually build the canal through the peninsula. Oh, okay. Jerry is mentioning that the Canal of Pharaohs was built in Egypt about 100 years earlier. Yeah. Hello? Okay. If we can go to the next slide. So now we're at the Great Procession, right? So now we don't know the exact size of the Persian army that Xerxes was able to pull together. Herodotus claims that it was 1 million strong, and that would be accompanied by another 1 million to 4 million auxiliary people. We're talking about the people providing the food, the people carrying the weapons when the soldiers aren't carrying them. We're talking about medics. We're talking about the entire Persian civilization that marched along with them. And at the front of that would be the Magi, right? The Magi are the priests of the Zoroastrian religion. They would be carrying the sacred fire, because the fire was the representative of Ahura Mazda and the light of civilization that they were bringing with them. It was very important to them to demonstrate that what they were doing was a civilizational expansion, that what they were doing is they were going to the outer regions of the world and bringing civilization to them. One of the things that was also really critical in making this massive army is that this massive army drained a lot of the able-bodied men from different parts of the empire, which meant that the likelihood of uprisings in the other parts of the empire would be less, simply because there would be fewer people to galvanize into an uprising. You can control them much more directly if you're watching them. And so you had a lot of these smaller Greek states like Thessaly, Thebes, and Argos taking the Persian side as they saw this march of this powerful army coming forward. But it wasn't even, if we go to the next slide, it wasn't even that the army was able to do this by itself. There was actually 6 years of planning that went into the development of the food and water that would be there for the soldiers when they arrived in these destinations. So you had 5 different depots that were built in Eastern Thrace and Macedonia, and Western Thrace and Macedonia region, in order to refill and restock the supplies of the military that was passing through there. And these depots, as I said, were found 4 to 6 years in advance of the march. So that way, for example, they could send the livestock there and they would be able to grow them and fatten them in time for them to be slaughtered for the Persians who were coming through, and therefore feed the military. So this was an incredible amount of planning that coincided with the planning to build the canal and build the bridge over the Hellespont. You could see from the Greek side that, that this incredible machination was happening. And from the perception of Xerxes, this would bring the Greeks into the mindset of, we should submit. This empire can literally rule the world. And they didn't quite calculate the Greek perception of these kinds of events, of not being those of a calculated civilizational enterprise, but those of being, very hubristic and over controlling. The Persians just didn't see it that way.
Richard,
Yeah.
could I just clarify one point on the bridges business, if my understanding is correct? So there were actually two endeavors. One was a bridge that was over on the eastern side of the sea, and then there was the canal. And the bridge was for the army, and the canal was for the navy.
Exactly
in terms
that.
of facilitating access.
Yeah, exactly. Because the army and the navy sort of, if you could say, marched in parallel. So wherever the army was, the navy followed them in the water, and the army stayed close to the seashore. So you needed the canal for the navy, and you needed the bridge for the army. But when we say needed, like, the canal was probably more necessary than the bridge, in that you could ferry. But the Hellespont was completely in sovereign Persian territory. They could ferry people back and forth. They had no issue worrying about interception from the Greeks at this point. So there's no need for a bridge. It's a demonstration of power. The canal makes more sense from a logistical perspective.
Can I also add?
Go ahead, Jerry. Go ahead.
Sorry, add something to that as a symbol, because in the end, after Plataea, the Greeks actually go and grab a piece of the cable from that bridge and bring it back to Athens. So it must have been, that was symbolic of them, of the power of the Persian Empire. I mean, it was a fantastic engineering feat to do something like that and maintain a set of, boats cabled together across that body of water.
So I have a question from Hadrian. Oh, you reading?
Wait, sorry. Hadrian asks, why didn't the Greek city-states attack the supply depots in Macedonia and in Thrace? And the simple reason is that those were Greek city-states that were Medized. Those were Persian ally states. So that's why they weren't attacked.
Speaking about the cable, just quick addition. I mean, and Richard, you already had mentioned it, and I apologize, is they use a lot of decommissioned ships and that cable was the high-tech piece of the whole bridge. The cable, not decommissioned ship, the cable was the high-tech portion of it. And that's why it was, that's why the Greek, yeah.
Was that the papyrus rope that you're
exactly
referring
that,
to?
yes.
That's okay.
Yeah, the cables were made out of papyrus rope. Which is surprisingly both flexible, because the ships have to move a little bit. The ships are anchored to the bottom of the sea, but the ships, do have some give and take, because there's a strong current that flows through the Hellespont. But at the same time, they need to be generally in alignment, so that way the bridge can hold, and the bridge doesn't break, by left to right or shifting. So that was the engineering marvel of the cables, is that they were able to hold the ships in relative position so that they all moved together, as opposed to moving separately, because of the way the current came through them.
All right, I think we're ready to move on to the actual battle now that we've talked about what was going on in that 10-year interim between battles. So I believe you're all fairly familiar with this term that was an epitaph that was written at Thermopylae in celebration of the resistance at Thermopylae by the Greeks. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie. To give us some context of where we're talking about in terms of geography for this battle, you can see that this is the zoomed out area that we're talking through. The red lines actually represent the flow of the Persian land and naval advance into this area of Greece. Over here on Euboea, we see Artemisium, which is going to be the naval part of the Battle of Thermopylae. And then we have Thermopylae over here on the Gulf of Malice here. This main area through here that you see is kind of like a black line. That is the actual pass, Thermopylae Pass. And this is where the Greeks are going to set up in terms of their main defense line. And we can see the Persians are going to be passing this way through the main pass. We'll get to this part. It's a little bit of foreshadowing, as I think many of you know about what's coming up here. That's what we've got going on here. I think the one thing that's really important is that we talk about the geography of the hot gates, and geography really is like a key character in all of these battles. The hot gates, they're called that because they are natural sulfur springs, which in ancient times as well as in modern times, to my understanding, they are places of healing, and people would come there to be healed because of the qualities of the water. It was at the time a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea, and it was wide enough for, they would say, like about 2 chariots or so to pass through simultaneously. On the one side is the mountain that's very steep, and then you have the sea on the other side. In between that area, stretching more like east to west geographically, is the plain, and that's kind of the playing field of the actual pass itself. To the south is another mountain range. Calidromus is the name of the main mountain there. And then, as we saw on the map, there's the Gulf of Malice here. At the time of the battle, and I think we talked about it the last time, it's height of summer. It's about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So imagine just wearing all of your gear, your battle gear, and having to perform under that kind of heat. This is what Thermopylae looks like today, which it doesn't look like much, but historians really have a lot that's working against them in terms of understanding what the geography was back in ancient times. One is that there have been 2 significant earthquakes that have really rattled the landscape. Secondly, there is a river that runs through this area that had left behind huge alluvial deposits, enough so that the sea is supposedly have to retreated up to 3.5 miles, 5 kilometers from where it was originally. So this pass has definitely widened to a much greater degree. You can also see over here that there is a pretty significant road that runs through it. So there's been even further leveling of this pass in order to construct this, modern thoroughfare. And so if you're thinking about it and what Richard has described, this awesome show of force and all of these soldiers and cavalry coming down, if you're in a squeezed position, it's like a funnel. You know, you can only get so much force exerted when you have such a narrow pass. So this played to the Greeks' advantage.
I wanted to add, Lisa, in the comments, somebody is asking, are the bare-chested Spartans in the movie 300 an accurate depiction of Spartan military regalia?
And I would say no. We did actually talk a bit about this in our last presentation, where we talked about how especially the Spartans were decked out in their armor, and they were wearing up to 70 pounds of armor, and that was, for the Spartans, that was bronze, and it included the helmets that covered almost their entire face, the bronze covering of their chest as well as their back. They had bronze armor on their legs all the way down to their shins. So they almost looked like you know, modern day Terminators is how I would envision it. I think that what we see on that image of the movie, the Spartans 300, the bare-chested is some of the stories that we hear about how the Spartans and some of the Greeks would basically be practicing gymnastics or warfare in the nude, and also that might be where that's coming from. And it also makes for a better picture.
And can I also add, can I just add to Lisa's point, know that they wore cloaks in battle. That's something that's constantly seen both Roman and Greeks. I mean, it makes no sense for them to be wearing cloaks. That's just going to get in the way, and it's obviously an opportunity for the enemy to bring you down. So that's just like a big foolish thing that Hollywood produces.
Yeah, exactly. Superheroes, no capes.
Yeah.
And it's a tradition in Greek art of showing naked warriors.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's a code for heroic, but no one fights naked.
I would say also from the movie 300, the Persians were deeply offended, like modern day Persians were deeply offended with the depiction of how Persians looked in the battlefield. We showed last time what Persian armor looked like. It's very diversified depending on the region that the person came from, but none of it looks like the armor that was demonstrated in 300. And Xerxes did not look like an effeminate gay man. That was probably the biggest negative reaction.
They used actually the 8 feet tall Brazilian effeminate gay man with piercings.
Yeah, and as Greg points out, Xerxes was not 2 or 3 times the height of a man. But no, like you could see from the picture, he looked a very typically Persian, sort of my face, very long beard. Persians, like the Babylonians before them, would have long beards. Sometimes they would put them in ringlets, but usually they would let it hang naturally. He actually had a lot of hair. Sometimes he would put it under the typical Persian crown, which was sort of more of this shape. It would go out and was made generally not of metal. Like the interior part was metal, but the exterior part was made of straw or thatch. He did not look like that.
Why straw or thatch? That's not terribly regal.
No, it's just a representative of the earth.
Oh.
By the way, we're talking about gender images and things in here, and the Persians had a woman admiral.
Yeah, I was actually going to talk about Artemisia.
Oh, okay.
We're going to get to her, but no. One of the things is that the Persians were, because of the diversity of the empire, more meritocratic than Greeks were, and so while Persian generals sort of chafed a little bit at the idea of a female military commander, the fact that she demonstrated her abilities very early on in the naval battle of Artemisium, she had equal standing in the rest of the Persian contingent. The Greeks, however, actually had a number of different bounties on her head, specifically because she was a woman, and how indecent of her as a woman to try and fight men. But from the Persian side, certainly there was misogyny, but it was nowhere near as extreme.
And I think that in terms of having that, the money on her head, it was also because she was an Ionian Greek, right? So she was not only a woman, but an Ionian woman that was fighting against the Greeks.
One of the most common themes in Greek temple art was the Amazonimachy. In other words, the war against the Amazons. So there was a big, one of the friezes on the side of the Parthenon was that, the same thing at Olympia. And so the Greeks had a long tradition of seeing female warriors as monsters, like really as monsters. Like
and I think that was, that may have been true for the majority of Greek, but Sparta was unique in the way of its treatment of women and all. Women had more authority, more power than did their other Greek counterparts at the time.
But they did not fight.
They did not fight.
They were not part of the armed forces. They didn't go out and engage in battle.
Correct.
So the Spartans really bought into the same tradition.
So I want to talk a bit now about who fought for the Greeks, because we do know that there were the Spartan 300s, right? That is part of our pop culture. But there were also upwards of another 3,700 hoplites that were participating in the Battle of Thermopylae, actually, that we don't talk about too much. The one that I really want to point out are the Thebans, because as we have talked about, Thebes had Medized. meaning that they supported Persia. So what are these 400 Thebans doing? There are conflicting accounts, which I'll talk about. The first is that, let me see, Herodotus thought that they were hostages that were brought to fight. Thucydides, however, thinks, and this is more, I guess, what historians lean toward as being the truth, that they were actual true Hellenic patriots. And they were people who had defected from Thebes and decided to fight against the Persians. So they're a very interesting and important part of the story. There were about 700 from Thespia as well. The Phocis and the Optonian Locrians, 1,000 strong, they were local people. So they had a definite invested interest in being there and protecting their own homeland. From Sparta, in support, we had Helots, the enslaved Greeks, and then we also have the Perioeci, who were in between the Spartan citizen.
Lisa, it's Perioikos.
Sorry?
Perioikos.
Perioikos? Okay,
Yes,
hopefully I won't have to say that again, but thank you. They were the outdwellers, and they lived in a class that was between the enslaved Helots and the Spartan citizens. And all they performed things like the arts, artisan things, as well as like trade for the Spartans. So about 4,000 there were at the beginning of the Battle of Thermopylae. So who's missing? There was a larger contingent of hoplites from the Peloponnesian area that were supposed to come to the Battle of Thermopylae. However, as we have seen previously with the Spartans, there were a lot of religious festivals and rituals that they adhered to extremely piously. And there was the Carnean festival that was occurring at this particular time, which was more important to them before they could they had to complete that in order to join the battle at Thermopylae. Also, there was, no one expected that Thermopylae was going to fall as soon as it did. So that was part of the reason as well that there were not as many representatives fighting for the Greeks at Thermopylae. And then I want to take a moment to dive a bit more into why 300 and why this was such an important battle to the Spartans. What you see here is an image of the main Spartan hero, Heracles. And in the story of Heracles, he actually dies not at Thermopylae, but close by in the mountains. His human form dies in the mountains close to. So there is a mythical calling for the Spartans to this area of Thermopylae. It is also the home of their ancestral forefathers, the Dorians. So they have a historical and ancestral tie to that area as well. 300 is a very small percentage of the total Spartan available army. Hoplites. It's about 4% of the what they figure was their contemporary number of able-bodied people to fight, men to fight. 300 is a number that was somewhat sacred or symbolic to the Spartans. It was also conceived to be a manageable number when fighting in a very constrained space, like at the pass of Thermopylae. These were the top of the top, the cream of the cream of the Spartan fighting force. These were the hoplites that fought right by the king and in all of the battles, and they were the elite force. And each of these fighters at Thermopylae needed to have a living son. And that has given rise to the theory around, the Spartans knew that they were just marching into a death mission, basically a suicide mission. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Just to touch on briefly the Spartan leader at Thermopylae, King Leonidis. We see this image here. This is a statue outside the stadium of Sparta. In all, there's not a whole heck of a lot that's known about him. What we do know is that he was married to his niece, Gorgo, who was the daughter of Cleomenes the First, the one that flayed himself while in prison in the last talk. And Cleomenes and Leonidis were half brothers. The reason that Leonidis actually takes the kingship and becomes the one of two kings is because Cleomenes does not have a male heir. And because Leonidis was not expected to be the king, he actually goes through more of the rigorous training, the agoge training, and I know some folks are going to be talking about that in the near future. But he goes through that rigorous training where, as I understood it, some of the other kings didn't go through that degree of training, some training, but not as thorough as did Leonidis. I'm going to talk now a little bit about really what sets up the Greeks' defeat at Thermopylae, and it's the pass of Anopeia. When Leonidis arrives at the gates of Thermopylae, he learns from some of the local people that there is the pass, the main area, Thermopylae, but there are also two other alternative routes that can work to against the Greeks. And only one of the two is determined to be a possibility where the Persians could actually breach and work around the Thermopylaean pass. They would have to be go in single file to get over the pass, but it was still doable. Leonidis on the spot decides that what needs to be done is that pass needs to be shored up and fortified and defended. And so who he sends are the local people, the people that have the most interest in protecting their own homeland, and that's the Phocian troops. They are deployed to guard the pass. Now, one of the things that's a bit controversial is that unlike the Spartans, pretty much unlike all of the other Greek hoplites compared to the Spartans haven't grown up in a Spartan military culture. So these are hoplites that are seasonal. You know, they don't have as much discipline. They don't have as much experience training. And they are sent off to guard the pass without any kind of Spartan leadership, which has been called into question as to why Leonidis would have done that. They're on their own, and they are there. Talk a little bit now about what actually happens now that we have people in position. What's going on? And I think this is a famous line, infamous line that has been touted about. And it's Xerxes who's asking of the Spartans, lay down your weapons. And Leonidis calmly recalls, come and get them. In Melon Labe, which we see written up about a lot. And it is an exchange that's attributed to Plutarch, actually, about this. So while folks are at the Thermopylaean Pass, they have a waiting game that occurs for about 3 to 4 days, and there are some strategic reasons why, as I understand it, the Persians are doing this. One is that the Persians are waiting for the Persian fleets to come and provide some support, and that's coordination that they need to do with the fleets. It also is demonstrating the force again in watching all of these various soldiers and cavalry descend and grow larger and larger before the Greeks' eyes. That applies a lot of psychological pressure compared to a contingent of 4,000 Greeks that's going to be fighting against the Persians. So what we see here is that the Persian camp is up here along the coast of the Malian Gulf Coast, and they're going to work their way down. There are 3 gates at Thermopylae, the western gate, which is the first area. Then there's this Phocian wall, and this is where the Greeks are going to actually set up their defenses. And as Leonidis and the Greeks come to the Phocian wall, they realize that it's in great disrepair, so they start to reinforce it to provide a greater defensive front. They will also be here at the eastern gates. On the first day of engagement, again, after they have waited there, Xerxes decides to send in a group of 2,000 Medes. Now the Medes, and I know that Richard talked about them previously, they do have some fighting skills for certain, and they also have some protection, but compared to like a Spartan clothes all in bronze, they really don't have much against them. They didn't wear any helmets or greaves. They are strong fighters, but not the best fighters. They have wicker shields and short javelins, which means that they have to be in very close contact in order to engage in actual fighting. They proved to be not much of a match for the Spartan forces. Xerxes will then follow up with an elite force, the Immortals, which will inflict more damage on the Greeks, but they are not, quote, victorious over the Greeks at that point in time. The Persian fleet, while all of this is happening, is hit by yet another one of the storms that just seems to keep happening to them, and it does kind of throw them off course. It doesn't decimate their navy, but it certainly doesn't help their navy. For the Greek side of things, on that first day, the strategy that Leonidis deploys is one of relays, and he does that because, again, we only have 4,000 total, now 3,000 total fighting force, because 1,000 Phocians have gone to protect the pass. So they are fighting in relays so that no one gets completely subsumed by exhaustion. They also are using feigned retreats. So they would move forward and then pretend to fall back, which would encourage their ones that they were fighting against to come into the middle, and they would then circle around them and kind of get them in a noose position. And that was how they were able to inflict a lot of damage upon the Persian fighting forces. Day two, this is a picture, actually a modern day picture of the Anopeia Pass that the Persians are going to work around in order to get at the Greeks' backside here. And the betrayer of this pass is a Greek farmer by the name of Ephialtes. And as I understand it, that translates today into Greek as nightmare. And I'll talk a little bit more about him shortly, but he betrays to Xerxes, hey, there is a way that you can work around the Greeks and gain an advantage. So Ephialtes is going to travel, leads the immortal force, that 10,000 force, over that path, and they will travel by moonlight. So this path isn't just a short walk up a hill, it's 1,000 meters up. It's a significant undertaking to actually get over it. The Phocians, remember, they're there on their own. They're kind of chill, kind of relaxed. They're not on their total guard. And the only warning they have is that they hear the rustling of leaves. And they are completely taken by surprise. They are easily moved out of the way. And the Immortals are going to descend upon the middle gate near Alpini, which is going to get the Greeks now in kind of a noose formation. Ephialtes, I think we hear more about him, and there was a couple of reasons for this. And one was that there was suspicion that the reason he did it was because he was going to be rewarded handsomely financially by Xerxes, by the Persians. That does not come to pass because the Persians are going to lose at Salamis as well. So there is not much booty that's going to be coming his way. He also becomes kind of the target of all the hatred that the Greeks have for anyone that was a Persian sympathizer. It becomes an easy target because the majority of Greek city-states are actually supporting the Persians, or at least are loose Persian allies to lessen the blow when the Persians, they believe, are going to win. And so they are kind of backing up and trying to put all of the attention on this betrayer Ephialtes, so that the pressure isn't on them so much as being part of the Persian sympathizers.
Elisa, let me add, the
Yes.
excuse that was used earlier for why they let the Persians walk through, same applies to this individual. He wanted to get the Persians off his farmland, I'm sure.
Good point. And just a note about what I had understood when the Persians were being hosted, it wasn't simply give us bread and water, and Richard, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was like they had really substantial, lavish demands upon those that were hosting them, to the point of, I think I heard they were eating off of like, fine metallic plates. And I don't know if that's just a rumor. Richard, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. But that's something that I'd heard, that to host them, it was a huge undertaking. It was like hosting a royal dignitary, of course, because that's what Xerxes was.
Absolutely. No, a lot of the Greek city-states became quickly tired of the Persian army because of the pomp and circumstance that Xerxes required. As I said, he was a man of the court, and so he didn't really have the understanding that somebody like a Cyrus or a Darius, who lived in a very difficult environment, would have.
You went on mute, Richard.
That to appreciate that the lifestyle that Darius had, the lifestyle that he had in the court, as Xerxes had in the court at Susa, was not the lifestyle that could be provided all across the empire and by small little city-states.
I'm going to move us on to the last stand at Thermopylae. So we're now on day 3, and the Persians have worked around and are on both sides of the Greeks and all. Another famous quote that we have, it's attributed to Leonidis during breakfast, their last breakfast at Thermopylae. "This evening we shall dine in Hades." In day 3, what do we know? We do know that Leonidis was clearly understood that this was now a death trap, a suicide mission. There was a council of war, however, that was called with the question amongst the commanders: do we stand and fight, or do we flee? What are the advantages to either side? From the point of view of Leonidis, it was wanting to minimize casualties and delay the Persian advance as much as possible. And you have to remember that part of the Persian advantage is that they have cavalry, and the Greeks did not, meaning that the Persians could definitely outrun the Greeks as they were retreating back to make a further southern defense line and all. So there is the decision to stay. However, some of the fighting force is dismissed. Now, I did read that there is some discussion, and I'm not sure where it stands right now, that perhaps Leonidis had asked all of the remaining fighting force, 3,000, to stay, those who hadn't been killed, to stay and fight, and that it actually was through defections that people had peeled off to retreat. I don't know if that's rumor, unconfirmed or what, but it was just something that I found was interesting there. So who ended up staying was a pretty significant force. It wasn't just the 300 Spartans. You've got the Thebans, Thespians, and you have Helots that were there as well. This is another rumor that I thought was interesting, and I thought I would bring up in this discussion, is an assassination attempt. And, try to put yourselves in the mind of Leonidis, knowing that, okay, we can stand here and we can fight and all, but is there an advantage to actually trying to do some crazy maneuver and assassinate Xerxes? Because if we're able to assassinate Xerxes, the Persians, their head of state will be lost, and they will be in disarray. So there is a rumor or a story that Leonidis orchestrated an assassination attempt, which of course proved to be unsuccessful. There is also further speculation that perhaps he went on the suicide mission to try and assassinate Xerxes as well. Again, not something that is confirmed. It is a rumor or a story, but something that I did come across in some of the literature. On this final day, as had been performed on other days of battle. There were the traditional rituals and religious undertakings that are performed before the battle on both sides. From the Greek side, there is the Greek seer Medizing, who foretells that there is impending death for all that remain behind. Now, he has a son that is part of the hoplite contingent that still remains at Thermopylae and is still living. So he begs Leonidis to please allow me to fight in his place so that my son can live. And Leonidis agrees to it. This Greek seer, Megistiasis, is going to be celebrated later, honored in an epigram that's written by Leonidis. And what you see here is an Attic red figure vase in black and white that is just kind of showing what one of the Greek sacrifices could potentially or did look like at the time, with people leading the victim up to the altar to be sacrificed. In the final fight that we have happening here at Thermopylae is we have Leonidis actually do something a little bit unusual, and he has the men go out beyond the Phocian wall, which, remember, was kind of their reinforcing line that they were fighting behind. And part of the theory is that he was wanting to spread out a little bit more to give his hoplites more room to be able to maneuver and attack, because it was just kind of like a one-on-one, all-out attack here. He will die early on in the battle, and one thing that drove his his hoplites into complete frenzy was that not only was he killed early on, but also his body was desecrated by the Persians. And it included he being decapitated, and I believe his head was put on display. The Greeks tried to recover his body, but they were unsuccessful, and it won't be until years later that I believe that they recover his bones from the site of Thermopylae. The Greeks then are going to have to retreat behind the Phocian wall, and they'll continue to fight very intensely, but they won't have that leadership that's kind of holding them together. You know, to the point of fighting, they start to, lose their arrow, not their arrows, but their javelins, their spears, their protective gear, their shields, and all that they actually are starting to fight tooth and nail. It's been written about. Just before most of the Greeks have been completely decimated by the Persian forces, a liaison officer slips away to inform Themistocles, that is stationed off of Artemisium on the boats and with the navy, that that we've lost at Thermopylae. He gives them the heads up. There are, and it's not talked about too much, but there are a few fighters on the Greek side that actually give themselves up as prisoners of war. And in the histories that Herodotus wrote, he really lays into them and considers them to be the greatest of traitors of Greece. In the aftermath, there was something like 20,000 Persians killed. As I was reading about it, I believe that there were more deaths inflicted on the Persian side on day 3 than there had been earlier. It included 2 of Xerxes' half-brothers. What it does accomplish, however, is that those that had peeled off from the Greek fighting force, those that stayed behind, it gave them time to fall back and get ready for a further defense, a defense further south. And it also was a morale booster for Greek loyalists, because they saw how courageous those that stayed behind had fought. They heard rumors of it, and it really gave people pause to think that there is a fighting chance that we can stand up to the Persians as they come about.
I wanted to add on the Persian side in terms of the casualties. The pass at Thermopylae was ideally suited for the Greek style of war as a phalanx, that is an armored division that creates a unified wall, because the real weakness of the phalanx is that you can get around it, or that you can get behind it and attack the side or the rear, which is not adequately protected. But with the width Thermopylae being so thin, the Persians were only given the direct frontal access, which is where the phalanx really shines as a battle tactic. So the Immortals and the Medes are known for being physically agile and moving quickly about the battlefield, which works if your enemy is dispersed, and it works very well if you're trying to cover large amounts of ground. The Persians had cavalry, but the problem is that none of those advantages worked at Thermopylae, and so the Persians have absurdly high numbers from their perspective of casualties and losses. Yeah.
Sorry, I thought you were finished, Richard.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add that, to add to your comment about the geography playing such a role, that in April 24th, 25th, 1941, when the 5th German Mountain Division was going down Greece, and with the invasion of Greece, the British put up a defense at the Hot Gates as well. Because of the geography, it funneled the Germans into a smaller geographic area where the outnumbered British, New Zealanders, and Australians could fight them off for a while.
Wow.
Just to add a comment.
Yeah, no, it's very common. I remember. Eventually, we'll talk about it because Zach wants to do some of the early wars for the State of Israel. In 1917, General Allenby actually came to an area and he discovered it was called Michmash. And he was a very devout Anglican Christian, and he was sure that he'd seen that name before. And there was actually a battle that Joshua had supposedly fought in Michmash, and Jonathan, the son of King Saul, had fought in Michmash. And so he actually read the choreography of that battle, and he replicated it against the Ottoman soldiers, and actually won a victory there. So it's very interesting how these historical battles, if you know the area and the terrain, you can replicate it. There's also something else that I wanted. There's also something else that I wanted to bring up from the comment section. We've been talking about the victors write history. It's not necessarily that we have the majority of the accounts from the Greek side because the Greeks survived and Persians didn't. The Persians very much survived this war. The war with the Greeks was at the edge of their empire. This did not destroy them at all. It's just the Persians didn't have a writing culture in the same way that the Greeks had a writing culture where they write stories about things. That just wasn't the Persian way. Persians would eventually develop a literary culture. But at this period in time, during the Achaemenid period, people wrote in this very sort of Sumerian, Babylonian style of, I came, I saw, it is powerful, I am powerful, I will destroy you. It's not this narrative structure that Herodotus, Thucydides, and Plutarch write in. So
it does sound a little bit like the St. Crispin's Day speech.
Yeah.
Later on, it's a pattern. If it was written by Herodotus, who's the Greek, it sounds like that speech. What we just heard. Same idea.
But, I was going to say, Richard, the Greek encounter may have been just a blip on the Persian screen, but they had committed a huge amount of resources, and Xerxes had personally led this whole campaign. So it was a major loss, even if the Greek conquest would have been relatively small from the Persian perspective.
Yeah, I agree with that. No, the reason Xerxes didn't write about it was number two, the writing culture, but number one, because it was such a humiliation, and Persians didn't like to record their humiliations.
But no, they didn't record their victories very much either.
Right. That's the writing culture.
On this is from Herodotus. Herodotus was the first historian in the world.
Yeah,
he was the first one. So this is the first series of events that were written about by someone who's recognized as a historian in the modern sense.
The other thing to think about Herodotus in terms of his accuracy in reading both sides is that a lot of the Greeks called him a Persian lover because of the way he spoke about the Persians and the way that he tried to get the story from people living in the Persian Empire, which leads a lot of more modern people to believe he has a even-handed, or at least as even-handed as he could be, being from one of the sides in this conflict, for evaluating how it happened.
So
wasn't he also from Halicarnassus?
Yes, he was.
I mean, so he was a kind of under Persian rule. Same
Yes.
from Artemisia, yeah, same city.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I don't quite understand something. At the end of this battle, and then afterwards at Salamis and Plataea and the rest of them, in fact, the Persians, they left after this battle. There was still an army in northern Greece, and they sacked Athens.
We're getting there.
Yeah, what I'm just saying is,
Yeah.
I'm just wondering why people are saying, feel like the
Before you get there,
think that they had lost anything. So
yeah, before
one last thing on Thermopylae, and that is, I was looking up in on Wikipedia, and they have the disambiguation. It's interesting. There are 7 different battles at Thermopylae with the same strategy.
Yeah, they're getting there, Jerry. They're going to get to all
No.
The
I'm talking about
disambiguation
ending in
automatic.
1941. So between 480 and 1941 AD, there's at least 7 or 8 major battles that occurred in the same place with the same sort of strategy.
Absolutely.
One thing One thing we didn't mention, Richard, I'm sorry, it's Leonidis, right? Just want to give a very brief story. When I guess the Leonidis had a half brother who was also a king, and right before he left or departed for the Thermopylae, his half brother died, and they promoted him to be a king. So he was relatively recently a king, and therefore, we also know that he went to the fortune teller, whatever they used to call him, and he told him, like, for the empire, for the Greeks to be saved, the king has to die. So he realized that it was him that has to die, basically, and that's why one of the reasons he went, it was a suicide mission. He took literally 300 of his soldiers, and his wife, at his departure, told him not only shield off the shield, she just, he actually told his wife, if I don't come back, please do remarry. Don't wait for me. He knew this was a suicide mission. He went on it, just in addition to it. Sorry.
Yeah,
And 300 was,
in case anybody misunderstood, the Greeks did not leave Leonidis' body on the field. They took it with him, and after the fight, he was mutilated. They never abandoned Leonidis.
After they were all dead.
After they were all dead, that's when the mutilation took place.
Right. But they took a few times from the Persians and back and forth. But 300 were his personal guard. From what I understand.
Yeah, it was 300 of his soldiers, 1,000 Perioicus, and 6,000 from the Peloponnesian side of Sparta, his allies.
Was it mentioned why the Spartans only produced 300 hoplites?
Yeah, Lisa. I was gonna say Lisa mentioned it, but go ahead.
Yeah, so it was considered, because it was such a narrow pass, there were a couple of reasons. One was more were supposed to be joining them at the battle, but they were in the midst of the Carnean festival, and so they were delayed. Second was, this was the elite of the elite. Third, that the 300 was considered to be a symbolic number and also a manageable number within a small constrained area. So they figured that there was going to be a less loss of life and hoplites, which were in short supply by only sending that many at that time.
Interesting. Lisa, was the massive Persian loss, is that indicative that they just kept sending wave after wave and it was simply an unsuccessful strategy? They should have just retreated and maybe waited the situation out for a couple weeks or something like that?
So I will give what I had understood, and then I'll turn it over to Richard. But one of the advantages, I think, and Richard has touched on it, this is simply because of the way that the Greeks fought compared to the way that the Persians fought in that tight formation in a constrained space. So there's that. Secondly, Leonidis also had a very specific strategy to save the kind of the strength of the fighters by having them, to perform in relays. So they would surge forward, they would fight for a while, they would get tired, they would retreat, and another group would advance on the Persians. They also were using a tactic of, fighting and then retreating, which would seem like they were actually fleeing, like they were turning away. And that would lure the Persian fighting forces into kind of the middle of the pass, and then they would surround them and cut them down. So those were some of the advantages I had read about in terms of how the Greeks were able to cut down so many of the Persian fighting force.
From the Persian side, from the Persian side, there was also the major issue of sustaining the soldiers. So it's not that the Persians could just sit there for a few weeks. That you have to think of all of the supplies that they would be consuming. They didn't have the supply lines. Where's Aaron when you need him? They didn't have the supply lines to be able to support this long.
I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah. I was gonna say, where are your supply lines, Aaron? They didn't have the supply lines to continue holding there for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks in order to see a break in the line. And there also wasn't any indication that there would be a break in the line. It's not like, the hoplites are only there for like 3 days and then they have to go back, home. That they were planning to camp there. They had sufficient supplies for themselves to stay there. So from the Persian perspective, there would be no advantage to staying there for long term. And it's also a massive disadvantage in terms of how difficult it would be.
Yeah, I mean, my take on it is the moment the Persians chose to accept that fight, they at best were going to get a draw, just because, the moment you allow yourself to funnel a larger force, there's all this physics that you've been talking about, right? It's just all your strengths just they turn into weaknesses because you're still having to reconcile the logistics support, the command and control, and a lot of people don't realize this, but when you're in a much tighter space, the tip of your fighting force is the only one that's actually engaging. And so, the reason 300 works and, whatever, it might have, could have been 800, whatever, but, not 20,000 is that's about all you would have in direct, especially given then the sort of standoff weapons that they had. That was about all you were going to get in the, what's called the engagement zone, like where people are actually engaging. And so the moment the Persians sort of accepted that, which I think is sort of out of ego, they were walking themselves into, this one way or the other, right? I almost don't view how, there's almost no way they could. I mean, the only way I could have imagined
is if they had artillery, but they have no artillery.
Yeah, or actually the only other way that would have sort of made sense, but then you're sort of respecting your enemy, right? Is you set yourself up into more smaller staggered units, but the way the Persian army was configured, that was sort of a harder thing to do. Yeah, because they had all this sort of, empire of super tribes, and when you're starting to sort of rob Peter to pay Paul to sort of, create these little, let's call them 500-man teams or, kind of early forms of battalions, and you just sort of, allowing each one to come in for 30 minutes or 20 minutes and then just cycling them. So that probably could have worked, but then you are sort of accepting that they on the other side were right and you were wrong in how you chose this fight. And I don't think the ego was such that was easy to do then.
But they ended up bypassing, within a day, they just bypassed them, which was, a reasonable strategy as soon as they learned of the pass.
Well, yeah, but they had to basically have an unnecessarily public, historically humiliating loss for the first day to then recognize, and I'm sure it was commanders that were screaming for hours, like, let's stop this is stupid, and then they eventually, obviously,
my only question is, I don't see it as a humiliating loss. I don't know whether the Persians did, and I don't even know whether the Greeks. I mean, I honestly don't know. But
well, no, the Persians saw it as a victory, but a victory that they won at a very high cost,
Exactly.
a cost that they shouldn't have needed to pay.
That's right.
That was the Persian perception, right? Because you have to remember the Persian army. This army has a history of 50 to 60 years of just plowing everybody into the ground.
Yep.
The fact they lost 20,000 soldiers to a military that was barely a blip on the radar, that was humiliating to them. Yeah. They still thought it was a victory, but like I think the right way to think about it is how Americans see the war in Iraq, right?
Yeah.
Like,
or to be honest, I actually see this as a much smaller but a version of the Tet Offensive, right? If you look at the Tet Offensive, at the end of the day, like in math terms, right? You had a lot of, there's a famous interview with General Giap, who's totally understudied. He's a genius, and because he beat everybody, Japanese, Chinese, US, French, I mean, like you name it. And a bunch of colonels, because he came to the War College like 20 years ago and said, well, we won every battle in the Tet Offensive. And he's like, yeah, that's interesting, but totally irrelevant. Because of what he was able to do with the impact, which was to show that this big, sort of impossibly to defeat sort of, enemy, you could wage a specific battle in a time and place of your choosing. And even though they could quote unquote win, what were they winning, right? It was someone that was a blip on the screen with 50,000 Viet Cong basically, which is sort of like a proportional view, I guess, as I'm looking at it,
Yeah.
But in this case, the Persians won militarily.
Yes, the Persians won, and they're going to continue to press their advantage. Right. But the thing is that they lost at a very high score. That was demoralizing.
I don't quite see the analogy as Aaron is making, because the Americans won militarily, but they lost politically. But here it seems like the Persians won militarily and politically.
Well, but there was no political win or loss at this point, right? Because it's not like there's Persian news media, broadcasting live from the scene.
There's no Walter Cronkite.
Good morning, Greek citizens.
That'd be actually, but
you understand what you understand what I'm saying, right?
Right. There was no political cost to Xerxes at this point.
If the Persians had won the battles of Salamis and Plataea, then no one would be talking about Thermopylae.
That's very true.
It's only because the Greeks repelled the Persians ultimately that they could crow and say, well, here was this great stand that, and make a big, a propaganda point that stood for 2,500 years. But had the Greeks lost, no one would have known, we wouldn't know about Thermopylae.
No, but doesn't it speak to the fact that the Persians, which were this, kind of super conquering machine, basically got its tracks ripped apart, and in multiple battles, most of which were ego-driven losses, right? Fundamentally, I mean, that's how I look at them, right? I mean, but when you have sort of this 100-0 victory sort of mentality, you really don't think anything is going to get in your way, and especially you think, I talk to God, I am God, whatever. And they finally ran in, and as everyone always does, to somebody who, as Joe Frazier said to Muhammad Ali, and Frazier Ali won. And, when Ali said, I'm God, and Frazier said, well, God, I'm going to kick your ass right now, basically is what he said. That's really what the Greeks or the Persians ran into with the Greeks.
Yeah, I think that, sorry.
Yeah.
I was going to say that I think my earlier comment on the St. Crispin's Day speech is probably the son of this battle in mythologies, modern mythology, and it's also replicated in the Battle of Balaclava. Ours is not the reason why; ours is to do and die.
Yep.
And it may be that this is the original episode that gave birth to all these subsequent stories of a small army defeating a much larger enemy.
Well,
Shall we just move on?
Yeah,
Because
exactly,
we didn't get to
exactly.
Artemisium.
Yeah, exactly. Let's move forward a little bit.
So,
all right. So
yep. Go ahead,
go
Richard.
ahead. No, it's you.
Okay, so our Artemisium, I'm just going to briefly touch on this. It is basically happening at the same time as Thermopylae. The Persians still, in spite of being hit by storms as they were making their way towards Artemisium, are still numerically superior. It actually ends in a Greek withdrawal, and part of the reason that Themistocles decides to withdraw, of course, is that his main objective to being in Artemisium is to provide kind of like support to the Thermopylae, the battle that's taking place at Thermopylae and all. And so there really is, after he has learned that Thermopylae has fallen to the Persians and that they are on their way down toward the south, that his next strategic move is to get into a defensive position at Salamis and all. He also does not want to lose any more of the Greek triremes because there's just not a lot to be lost compared to, again, the Persian superiority and all. As Themistocles has made this decision, what he ends up doing is lighting a bunch of fires and creating a lot of smoke, and this is happening at nighttime and all. And part of that is to mask the fact that he is actually retreating and that the Navy is leaving their position at Artemisium, hoping that there's a delay from the Persians in terms of following the Greek fleet. Also, he slaughters animals that are on the island of Euboea so that the Persians don't have any further food source that they could take advantage of from that particular island. But this is considered a draw. There were losses on both sides of this particular battle.
Yeah.
Could I also add?
Go ahead.
I don't know if you're planning to, but well, obviously because of the storm, they wanted to outflank Themistocles and go around the Euboea, but the storm destroyed the Persian fleet. So that allowed Themistocles to withdraw eventually and get to Salamis. Otherwise, they would be trapped. But the other thing is that, yeah, the Themistocles employed very interesting tactic. He left very visible messages talking to Ionians, saying, "Don't fight us, brothers," or if you have to fight, don't fight full force. He kind of creating distrust within the Persian camp, so they started to mistrust Ionians. There were a lot of them on the Persian side, so this is that's why Themistocles was called trickster. I mean, he used the psychological warfare.
He also sent numerous Greeks with false information to be captured as spies. So no, Themistocles was thinking very much in this sort of mental game wars as well as the physical interactions.
And the Ionian, the story of the Ionians, Greg, that you just brought up, we'll talk a little bit about when we get down to the actual Battle of Salamis and what happened.
I'm sorry if I.
It's a great lead-in.
I was going to say, I think we're actually there now. I think the next couple slides are sort of discussion of the cultural impact of 300, but we've sort of talked about that. So I think we can skip actually to the Battle of Salamis.
Got it. Okay. So just very quickly, because someone did mention, the portrayal of the Greeks, did they fight in the nude and all? And this is just a modern, well, from the 1800s, painting by Jacques-Louis David, dates from 1814, and you have Leonidis here portrayed in the nude fighting at Thermopylae.
You can also see his pale white skin, which was very characteristic of Greeks from that period, because nobody from Greece would look like me, but they'll look like tall, blonde Scandinavians.
Yep. I do want to just mention also kind of the legend of the 300 Spartans, and why is it that we always talk about the 300 Spartans but not the rest of the people that actually fought at Thermopylae. There was some, according to some historians, there was some kind of marketing that needed to be done by those Peloponnesian forces that didn't make it to the battle, and they were seen, they had some shame. And so they were really trying to promote how courageously the Spartans fought. And there was no doubt that the folks that stayed back, the hoplites that stayed back and fought, were brave. There's really no question of that. However, there was a lot of emphasis not on everyone that fought, but really on the 300 Spartans that fought in Leonidis. They also really played up, I think, what Paul or Zach had mentioned around the prophecy from Delphi that a great king must die. They really played that up, and so they are looking at the sacrifice of Leonidas as being a key factor in their ability now to further resist the Persians. There is an historian at the University College of London who has quoted, it was Thermopylae that created the myth that Spartans always win or die. And from his perspective, you know, I think, Zach, you might have brought up that this was seen as a suicide mission. And while he believes that, yes, if it was just 300 people that were going to be sent as a sacrifice, he could see that. But again, because the Greeks had so few hoplites in comparison to the huge, massive force that the Persians had, he didn't think that it was truly believed that this was a suicide mission. Because there were 4,000, maybe for 300, but not for a total of 4,000. Some of the legacy of the fight here, at least in Sparta, is we have the glory of Dionysus, and he is considered one of the greatest Spartan warriors, Spartan hoplites that fought at Thermopylae, and he's the one that infamously said after being approached by a fellow hoplite, that was saying, kind of scared that, hey, there's so many Persian archers that they're going to blot out the sun when they fire their arrows and stuff. And so he just replies with the quips, so much the better, then we'll fight them in the shade. And all. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the shame of Aristodemus. And Aristodemus was one of 2 Spartans who contracted some kind of a eye infection just before the Battle of Thermopylae that left him blind. And his fellow hoplite, Eurytus, decided, in spite of being blind, to stay behind and to fight. Aristodemus chooses to go back home because he figures he's going to inflict more damage by being either in the way or even hurting or killing his fellow Spartans. So he decides to go back home, and he was considered to be kind of the scum of Spartan society, so much so that for the regular rituals that people would perform in lighting fires, he was no longer given access to fire. He was also called the worst of insults, which was a trembling coward. And a year later, he's going to fight at Plataea under Pausanias, and he wants to redeem himself by forging ahead into battle and just sacrificing himself and being seen as a hero on the battlefield. But in spite of him taking that and basically going on a suicide mission, he's seen as yet further disgracing Spartans because he has broke rank and formation and not listened to the commander that had people set up in a particular line. So even then, he's never forgiven. And the legacy, just really quickly, I think so many of you are familiar with these images. Again, you've got the bare-breasted man, Leonidis on the cover of the movie 300. You've got the Gates of Fire. If none of you have read it, it's a pretty entertaining book. Chocolates, the Leonidis chocolates from Belgium. And it's everywhere in our pop culture, from poets from the 1800s to modern day poetry. It was the ultimate kind of David and Goliath story, but it also was a fight not just about territory, but it was about ideology as well. And now we're moving on to the Battle of Salamis. And I want to pause here because we are at 11 o'clock or 2 o'clock time. And so I just want to figure out, are we moving forward? We got a couple more, we got some more slides to get through.
Yeah, go for it.
Are you sure? Because Zach, there's probably about an hour to an hour 10 minutes worth of material.
It's certainly too much.
I have to go in 20 minutes because I have an appointment.
Can we text you our questions then, Richard?
Yeah, sure.
I was kidding.
Questions are always welcome. Go ahead, Mark.
No, I know. I didn't have any ready. I didn't have any ready in the chamber. I just wanted to make sure I could take up more of your time, that your time was devoted to answering my questions. Jokingly.
Okay.
Well, listen, I just want to say, Richard, Lisa, you did an awesome job, and I have to head out, and I look forward to seeing this on YouTube. So, awesome job. Awesome job. See you guys next time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I
So,
my vote would be to pick it up. You know, not try to rush through the end of it and have everybody exhausted at the end. My personal feeling.
Okay.
yeah, Zach, what do you say? Yeah, do you think we should stop now and just do it in 2 weeks?
2 weeks what? I have already everything planned, my friend. Don't mess with my schedule, Greg. Okay.
Well, we could shift it. We could shift it. No.
He's like, please don't touch my schedule.
Schedule for like for a year and a half already.
But listen, Zach, the whole, we did the same thing with the Pacific thing. There was supposed to be one presentation and ended up being, I think, 3 so far, and there's still one more coming, at least. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to say we have a 2-hour session and say that everything's going to run for 3.5 hours. It's not right.
So how long more you guys have? About an hour or so?
Yeah,
at least, maybe more.
At least, because we have to cover the Battle of Salamis, we have to cover the Battle of Plataea, we have to cover
the schedule shouldn't be sacrosanct.
Yeah, no, and I think everybody who's up for presenting on the Saturdays, I mean, I can't speak for Lisa, but I know between Zach and Paul, and Greg, that we're always here. So I don't think that'll be an issue.
All right. So
absolutely, I think we should.
But the question is whether it's an issue for Lisa as well, because
no, I'm fine.
So
fine.
guys, if you want to trade one of my Pacifics just to sort of flow, and then I can, I've got 4,000 more of those, so don't worry, I don't care.
No. Yeah, seriously, if you guys want to do it next week on Sunday at 4, is it okay?
Next week on Sunday, what is it, the 11th?
And then so we double up. Instead
of Pacific, and then we'll do Pacific in 2 weeks from there. Because I don't know what's happening with Vlad. He hadn't responded yet, so maybe I can move Kosovo to another week or so I can then sacrifice one of the Sundays.
Yeah, no, you know what? That I think that works. But what is that? Zach, how about you send out that as a mock schedule? Lisa and I will confirm with you if that works for us and our times.
Yep.
And if it doesn't, then we'll figure out some other alternatives.
Yeah, and at a serious level, I mean, use my Pacifics as sort of this shock absorber.
No. The difference is that Vlad was supposed to present the Kosovo War. And he hasn't been able to be contacted, which means that's a great cushion that we can use as well, and we don't have to take away from your time.
All right, let's just finish it up offline.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right. Well.
All right.
Thanks.
Great job, everybody.
Awesome.
Wait. Does anybody have any questions before we want to close this out?
Yeah, just my comment or question, I guess. Speaking of democracy, there are 21 people and there were more before. You might just want to ask, in terms of scheduling, get a general sense of when people, because I think there's a lot of people who are very interested in this. And also, thank you very much. I thought it was great.
Yeah, amazing.
I mean, I can't believe we have people here from Paraguay. That's phenomenal.
Baby.
If you're coming tomorrow, by the way, tomorrow we have whoever can come. Right now with COVID pandemic, we don't want to mess with anybody. First of all, thank you, Richard and Lisa, for this amazing presentation. Second, tomorrow we have Marani lunch. If anybody wants to join, if not, then we'll post everything. The tasting, and we'll talk a little bit about the cultures, which is an ancient culture living in Georgia. We'll talk about the Georgian food. So it's going to be like a more relaxed type of atmosphere. Some of you have been to the restaurant, and we're going to be sitting outside. So I have about 3 more spaces to reserve, if anybody wants to join. I have 9 people committed, and 3 more spaces to go. That's one thing. Next week, then, with your permission, we will continue on, Battle of Salamis and the continuation, plateau and all that stuff. And then the following week, I don't want to, mess with the Phoenicians because we've been kind of preparing. And Ralph, you're up for in 2 weeks, Phoenicians?
Yep.
Okay, so you want us next weekend?
Yeah, on Sunday.
On Sunday, right?
On Sunday. Okay, Sunday
at
before
4. At
October
4
11th.
o'clock.
Yeah, 4 p.m., 1 p.m. Pacific.
Yeah, I'll send a new schedule out.
Does that work for you, Lisa?
Through.
Works fine.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah. And
All right.
this was really good.
Awesome.
Also, one more thing. I'm looking for somebody, my warrior soldiers, to do a Stalingrad in 2 weeks. If anybody wants to do Stalingrad, it's going to be Q&A session like we did with Rise on
Okay.
Hitler. Who wants to do it in 2 weeks? Any takers?
I'll jump in. Anyone else does?
Me too.
I think Hadrian said
All right, so it will be a combination. What was going to happen is there's going to be a Q&A session like we did Rising of Hitler. I posted it. If you guys looked at it, this is the way we do it. First 10 minutes, we give a summary of what happened. And then the rest is just pure Q&A. Any questions you have, any, opposing, pro, against type of stuff. And, don't be afraid to throw controversy and then somebody would answer it. It's obviously not a battle, but I want to create where there's going to be a heated discussion, so to speak. So it's going to be a heated discussion, and that's going to be in 2 weeks. And I've been working on getting a scholar, and so far she's signed up to do Women in Viking World in November. So October she couldn't do it because we couldn't. She lives actually in Scandinavia, so I couldn't really get her. And so she will be joining us in November. I'll post that as well. Okay, guys, and just want to go ahead. Anybody have any questions? Sorry. That's it.
Thanks. It was great.
Thank you
It
very
was
much.
amazing. Thank you,
Okay.
guys.
Bye, everybody.